All right. My name is James McBride, and I am talking to you from my living room in Lambertville, New Jersey. I'm sitting in the living room contains my piano, a lot of my music paraphernalia. Next to this room is my writing room, which contains my typewriter and computer and all that jazz. Um, I move from one room to the next during the course of my day when I write. I write and then I come here and play a little bit or play my saxophone a little bit. Then I go back and write. My new book is called Deacon King Kong, and it's about a community in Brooklyn that was inspired by Red Hook housing projects where I was born and where I still work. And it's about a deacon an old deacon from the church who drinks, joy juice to be happy, and he gets really tagged one day. He just gets blasted and picks up his old pea shooter and goes out into the plaza and shoots the worst drug dealer in the housing projects. He doesn't kill him, but he shoots him in, and this shooting sets off a wave of activity that allows us to see the church, the neighborhood, the people, the environment of Brooklyn, New York in 1969 when this book takes place. So I wrote it because it's a neighborhood that I really love. It's a community that I really love and still, and that was part of my life and remains in my spirit. And that I still have a lot of connectivity to. My parents started a church in Brooklyn, small storefront church, not a storefront church, but a tiny church. And that church still exists. It's in the Red Hook projects in South Brooklyn. So I wanted to create a world that most people only see from behind the wheel of a tightly locked car, and to let the wider world see how people in the projects live. I recently read about Donald Hall, who died, the poet, and he lived in, I think it was a small town in New Hampshire. And, even though his community was extremely different from the one that I grew up in and that I still am part of, there are enormous similarities. And I try to show those similarities so that my community isn't seen as sort of kind of a stereotypical place where people get shot and they always, they want tennis shoes and listen to hip hop music all the time, and everyone, wants to play basketball and all this other stereotypical stuff, which is just not the people. It's not the community. It's not the people that I know. So that was how this book was. That's the reasoning behind Deacon King Kong, and I wanted to make it funny because my community is a funny place, and Black people know how to laugh. We do that very well, probably too much. And that's not to say other groups don't know how to laugh. Jewish people are very funny. Irish people, crack me up. But I just wanted to show what this community looks like. And in addition, this book is not just about African Americans. It has several major characters who are white, Italian, Irish, and so forth. Because Brooklyn back then was a mixed community, like it is now, but in a different way. So that's really the premise of this book. It was meant to be a joyful ride to see how people have learned to cope and to live, to be happy. Well, there's no certainty to life when you're an African American in this country, because the race problem is not Black people. The race problem really emanates from the fact that, the moment you're born, when you're African American, your politics and your sociology, your social standing is written in the color of your face. So you have to learn how to cope with that piece of business. And some of us have learned to do it better than others. But it's the coping, that's where the story is. The coping is the joy, and the joy is the journey. And when you write books or poems or anything, you want to take the reader or the viewer or the art appreciator on a kind of journey that allows them to see that we can do this. I mean, everybody knows that this country is being dismantled by, a group of criminals. But yet we manage, and we will manage to overcome it, because that's who we are. That's part of what makes America special. Characters are everything. They feed the whole business. I mean, you see this room here. This room is full of paintings and junk and paraphernalia of my life. But it doesn't mean anything if there's no one here to see it or enjoy it or share it. Life is worthless without. What's the point of having something if you can't share it with somebody? So when you create characters, you're allowing people who you'd like to meet into your space, so that they might give you some understanding as to who they are. And then your job is to share that with a reader in a way that allows you to see the humanity and kindness and goodness of that character. I've just always loved to play music. I don't love to record it, and I hate to rehearse. And I don't like a lot of the stuff that music involves, professional music involves, because a lot of it's just you just have to love music. I don't love music enough to go on the road for 6 months, and not that people do that anymore now, but even as a young man, I didn't love it enough to practice. After school, I didn't love it enough to practice for 4 or 5 hours a day like some of these cats, some of these men and women. Writing, on the other hand, was easy, because you could just sit there and think, and bing, good things happen. Well, it was a way of making a living when I was younger. I worked at the Washington Post, and I worked at Boston Globe, and I covered Michael Jackson for almost, I guess it must have been 8 or 9 months when he was hot, when he was big. But the process of writing and creating characters, some of that comes from the business of learning how music works, because music requires a certain technical knowledge that you just have to be able to understand in order for melody to grow. So here's a crude example. I mean, right? That's a song everybody knows. Well, that comes from your ability to know that this note can be played, this way, or this way, or this way, or this way. And so you're dressing up this character with these other characters. And that comes from just the technical knowledge that jazz harmony and jazz arranging, and the knowledge of jazz that I acquired from my years of playing and studying at Oakland Conservatory and so forth. So with writing, you have the same business. You have that, and then this character is going to do something, and what he's going to do determines the flow of your plot, because your plot is based on the push and pull of good and evil within that character or set of characters. Now, my job is to make sure that this character moves toward the commonality of the human experience. And so I'm restricted in the sense that I can't create characters that simply pull out a pistol and shoot the guy and then jump out the window and shoot somebody else, and then they have guns to each other's heads. And I mean, I can't do that. There's a reason. If there's a reason or a causality behind it, then the exploration of that reason is the story. So in Deacon King Kong, for example, it happens to begin with an act of violence, but then the book stretches on for 250 pages, working around that one act to show the reader why this happened. culturally, American ingenuity is deeply rooted in African American music, and not just jazz. I mean, gospel. I've always felt because I grew up in the church. Gospel. I've always felt is a music that is rarely studied, rarely understood, misused, and co-opted for everyone's purpose without people really understanding the technical ingenuity behind it. There's a lady named Bernice Reagan who lives in Washington, D.C., who's just an extraordinary musician, who's done some fantastic work with the Smithsonian. And readers would be wise to catch up to Miss Reagan before she exits this life. I don't know how old she is, but she's not 25. And one of the things that she and others of her type have come to understand based on their own being raised in the church like I have been, is that just the technical ingenuity of gospel music is something that is very rarely studied and very rarely understood. For example, this is just like when you're in church and the minister's saying, yes, well, and stay well, and everyone, we're going to pray for everyone, This progression, it's called secondary dominance, I believe. And it's something that you just won't hear this in Italy. The movement of the technical movement of the harmonic approach of music that came out of gospel in the late 40s and early 50s is really the basis for an enormous amount of fantastically rich music, and most of all pop music and jazz as well. I mean, it's just that it all comes from the same tree. You learn that there are certain things that you just have to work around. It's just called living. And you learn to work around the things that are difficult and to find solutions that work so things can keep functioning, because there is no justice for so many people in this country. People without money, people without jobs, and so forth. And not all of them are Black people. And some of the people who deliver injustice are not white. Some of them are Black. So you learn that there are certain battles to fight, and there are certain things you just leave alone. And that kind of reason, that kind of like standing back and doing just what you can do within your own framework, is part of the culture, I think, of a good church. I'm not talking about these super duper churches where they pass around 5-gallon buckets, ream these poor people for their last penny. But I'm talking about a really good church that you just learn to say, this is what we can do. We do what we can do. And that's really how it works. You don't make a committee. You actually just go ahead and do what you can do. And try to just ignore the persons around you who are doing whatever they're doing, because in the long run, it's your ledger that has to be weighed against, when you make that your final journey. My job is to find out how people talk. That's what I get paid to do. So I'm always listening to what people have to say. I tell my students, at NYU, I say the best expression you can have when you're talking to someone is to say, is that right? Is that right? Because even if you think you really don't. And oftentimes, how you say things are more important than what you say. So with characters, look, if John Brown is going, would speak about, he wants this room cleared out right now. John Brown himself, whose picture you see behind me, if John Brown walked into this room and I was a slave owner and he said, I want to take your slaves right now, he wouldn't even say that. He'd say, I'm going to free every Negro in this room right now. I'm going to take all these children of God with me. And unless I had a shotgun in my pocket, I would say, okay, Mr. Brown, I'm losing a lot of money when you take, quote unquote, my people. But you go right ahead, because I know John Brown is the type to pull out his pistol and drop the hammer on it and tell the hammer to hurry into place as fast as possible. So how he says it and who he is are a blend of that character. In Deacon King Kong, the principal character is an old guy from the South who came to New York, and he still talks like he's from the South. So he has that sort of that rich tapestry of Southern twang and Southern dialogue that is just so rich and so straight and perfect, so direct that you'd be doing him or her a disservice by not allowing that language to show itself. So I tend to rewrite dialogue all the time until it really fits to what the character's saying, to who the character is. You have to get to it. You have to state the melody and let the reader know why you're there, because we don't have the attention span we once had. I mean, I read somewhere recently that the average 65-year-old person spends 12 years of uninterrupted time in front of a television set. Now that's just, I mean, you can go all through this house, you won't find one TV set. I mean, life is short enough as it is. Why am I going to sit there? You know what you're looking like when you're watching TV? You look like this. I mean, somebody's just pumping stuff into your head. I mean, I'd rather sit at home, eat bananas than just look at some. My point is that we have to learn to listen. And I think we've forgotten to learn. We've forgotten how to do that. And it's hurting us because we don't even listen to each other. Oh, I have a lot of hope. I'm so proud of what has just happened with these kids, these young people running around here with the Black Lives Matter movement. I can't tell you how proud it's made me feel. It's given me enormous hope. I think I think our future is a lot brighter than we know right now. It's always darkest before the dawn. We've suffered tremendously these past 3.5 years, but these recent events with the tragic death of George Floyd and so many others has inspired these young people who have burst out of what I thought was the cynical cloud that covered their entire generation because they have computers and they have the internet and they can look at stuff and they think they know stuff because they Googled it and so forth. But to get up out of your house and march in the street, to stand up and actually be counted on in the business of race, it has really inspired me in terms of watching these. It's inspired me to see these kids. Look, I come from a generation where when I sat down, as a young man, when I sat down to talk about race problems with white people in school or wherever, it was always like 10 Black people and 3 white people. It should have been the other way around. So now it looks like it's the other way around. And that means that real change, I believe, is possible and it's coming. And it doesn't have to be in a figurehead. It's not one person doing it. It's a swelling of moral righteousness that has been lit. It's a fire. And that's not easy to put out. Think about it. If you're 18 years old, you're not going to forget the time you were marching, in Washington, D.C. and they tear gassed you. You won't forget it. Donald Hall talks about, the late Donald Hall in his book about essays over 80, talks about how when him and his son went to Washington, D.C. to protest the war in Vietnam in 1969. What a gifted man he was. Poets are like dinosaurs, man. They walk alone. He was one of those. And, no, I'm not pessimistic about the future at all. I'm very excited that I hope God lets me see what will happen next, because I'm very excited about what these young people are doing now. They're going way further than we went. We left them with a pile of dung, and they're turning it into magic dust. You'll see. Well, if I could speak to them, I'd say, I'm sorry that we didn't do the job that you're doing now. Don't get hurt. Keep doing it. Just keep doing it until you can't do it no more. But don't get hurt. And take good notes, with a pen and a paper. because there's nothing like looking back in the cone of memory to tell you what happened. Anyone can, make a videotape, and that's important in many instances. But the fabric and the labyrinth of memory carries so many different vitamins and minerals. And so as you pass through it, so much, you'll grow so much stronger if you have the memory itself to power you in the coming years, because there are some difficult days ahead. But I'd say to them, we are so proud of you. Just don't get hurt, and keep peace in your heart, and keep the struggle on with. We're watching, and we're inspired.